Shout out also to John Stapleton, who also is an early supporter and tremendously helpful as we designed this index. Thank you to Liz, thank you to the folks at IROC for hosting and putting this important symposium together. I was very excited to come down where I live in Ottawa. It's actually no snow here, which is great. So I'm here to introduce you to the Neighbourhood Financial Health Index, which is a new composite measure that we've developed at the Canadian Council on Social Development in partnership, very close partnership with Prosper Canada. In my few minutes, I'd like to introduce you to the index and also to provide some highlights from an initial analysis that we've done with one of our community partners, the City of Toronto. So we'll go through the slides. I know the time is short, so I'm getting on with the show. Let's see. All right. Whoops. Okay. So this project fits very squarely with a larger set of issues that we've been discussing today about the drivers of financial health, and in particular the role of wealth and debt, specifically for household as well as societal well-being. Liz mentioned this. We have huge gaps in the evidence base here in Canada, particularly with respect to publicly available information on wealth and debt at the community level. And the role that they play in influencing or undermining household financial security over time. Andrew gave us a fantastic overview of the Survey of Financial Security, of course, but as a national level picture, it's necessarily of limited value to the folks working on the ground in communities and the like, municipal decision makers who are very interested in understanding how the trends we've all documented here in Canada, certainly as obviously in the United States as well, how that's playing out locally. What does that look like in neighborhoods across the city? So with that sort of motivation, we really felt that we could look at what we might be able to do to sort of direct attention to the many factors that are influencing household financial security beyond income alone through the creation of this index. And through this effort as well is to really highlight the importance of place in our understanding of financial security, because it really does matter where you live, and the importance of neighborhoods. So we wanted to create a tool to help us do that and to provide immediate advice and guidance to, as Liz said, the community sector, who too often is an afterthought in our work, but are leading the charge for change. So our hope certainly with the index is to engage communities and policymakers alike, to catalyze and inform dialogue, as well as to drive change through more effective policies and programs, better targeted interventions, certainly to build financial resilience. And really, actually, really importantly, and we haven't talked about this morning, is how are we going to be able to ensure that we understand whether our collective efforts are making any bit of good of difference at the community level. So really thinking about generating evidence that can support practice and evaluation at the local level, which is a critical need for community folks involved in the community financial empowerment agenda. Okay. So that was a basic overview. So as I said, I'm here to introduce the Financial Health Index and some of the partners there. All right. So the Financial Health Index is or the NFHI, which I'm going to trip over because it doesn't roll off the tongue particularly well, is a multifaceted picture of financial health. It's a weighted index that combines average total household income, mortgage debt, consumer debt, real estate assets, liquid assets, here including savings and debt, as well as the proportion of poor households in a given neighborhood or community. Definitions are provided there. It relies on Wealthscapes, which is a data product that's based on advanced estimation techniques produced by Environics Analytics. In the background paper we've done, or the concept paper in developing the index, we looked at a variety of data sources, and we elected to use Wealthscapes and working closely with Environics Analytics. It was an interesting exercise, not having in the community research sector, working with a product like Wealthscapes, but it also was the only source reliably that provided consistent information for all households down to the DA level, and this was important in our trying to find something to build a robust index, and we thank all the effort and time that the folks at Environics spent on this on our behalf. So just to briefly say, the NFHI for each geography or area covered has an overall NFHI score that represents the behavior or the performance of our 6 sub-indicators as measured and ranked against a community or a national benchmark. Each indicator itself represents the weighted household average for the specific geographic unit. And through obviously constructing the index, we have standardized and weighted and then summed the values. It is presented, this is our starting prototype, the NFHI is presented through an online mapping tool, which helps us to dig beneath the national level statistics to discern the unique patterns that exist in communities, to look at the unique patterns of financial health. So the tool allows users to see how a neighborhood or a municipality or even a larger geographic area ranks against its peers or the national benchmark, the Canadian benchmark, with respect to the index and its sub-indicators. We've taken this further step of color coding our findings. The red shades predictably denote poor financial health, and those are typically households or neighborhoods, DAs and households in neighborhoods in the lowest. The 2 bottom deciles, we have those DAs coded or areas in orange or yellow are moderate financial health, those are in the 3rd or 4th, and various shades of green denote more positive financial health. This obviously is a snapshot of the City of Toronto. I should have zoomed into where we are, but U of T is a very unique micro. It wasn't going to be very good financial. So users click on a geography, and a pop-up box appears with the information about the selected geography. Here they are right here, the overall index, their ranks on each of the different indicators. You can see, again, this is all based on a neighborhood in Toronto as based against the Toronto benchmark, the community average. The values of those different benchmarks are provided in the box to the right. Sorry?
That's our office neighborhood.
It is, I did. That's right. Yes, that's right. This is where Prosper, yes, I didn't realize that. I'm looking at that going,
it's not a prosperous neighborhood.
It isn't a prosperous neighborhood. So there they are, as well as definitions. So the mapping tool, as I said, is designed for users of different, in communities and the like, to zoom in and to find some very high-level information as well as their overall ranking in our index. This particular neighborhood is actually, wow, 300 and there are 3,600 DAs in the City of Toronto. This one ranks quite low on the list, and that's actually at Yonge and Bloor in St. Clair. Yeah, okay.
But we've got good liquid assets.
Good liquid assets, that's right.
We're resilient despite the debt.
So this is our index, and it's a very speedy summary of the index. There is a concept and design paper behind it, and I'm happy to chat to people afterwards about how we went about going through and making the selection and choices. Obviously, there are, as you all know, a huge number of choices involved in doing something like this. I will say that it was very important to us in looking at weighting, and we consulted widely on this, to create an index that highlighted and privileged the importance of income as a determinant of financial health, as well as poverty, particularly as we're looking at the neighborhood levels. So the weights in this index are more weighted. The poverty is weighted more heavily in this index as a predictor of financial health. So what then? We've now looked at the impact for where Prosper is located at Yonge and St. Clair. What does our analysis say about the City of Toronto? So in the next few minutes, I'll present some of our high-level findings to see how we can use the index, hopefully. I would like to say at the onset that we looked and chose to look at, in this study, at very small neighborhood areas of 400 to 700 people. So these are called dissemination areas by Statistics Canada. They are DAs. It's a very small, the real smallest area. The City of Toronto itself has 140 neighborhoods. These are the building blocks of those neighborhoods. And so we're looking at patterns of these very small geographic areas. What are some of the high-level findings? Well, not surprisingly, we found, as many other people have found looking at studies, I think of David Halchansky and his work at the City at U of T right here down the road, that there are substantial financial gap in Toronto between neighborhoods and DAs in particular, taking income, assets, and debt into account. So this chart here shows you, for instance, that the average value of real estate assets among DAs at the top of the NFHI index is 8 times what the value of real estate assets among DAs in the bottom 10%. And that's roughly the average of $1.5 million as compared to $179,000. And of course, what stands out here is the disparity between the top and the bottom with respect to liquid assets. So the top deciles or communities in the top of our index have liquid assets valued 18 times greater than those in the bottom. Interestingly, you see the gap in debt actually is considerably smaller. So the gap in mortgage debt is only 5 times between communities at the top of the index and those at the bottom. And for consumer debt, it's twice. So that tells you something about levels of indebtedness and the spread between those communities. Looking at the issue of debt more closely, we see here, and we know certainly, we've talked about it, that household debt has been outpacing income growth for many years, and that's particularly true in Canada. We're unfortunately a leader in this field over the last number of years. According to our data, for all households in Toronto, the average debt-to-income ratio is 140%. In other words, obviously, that for every dollar of total income, that's important, it's total income, households owe $1.40 of mortgage and consumer debt. Of course, the rate's even higher when you look at the debt to disposable income ratio, as the Bank of Canada does. But our data reveal that the overall average is 140%. Looking further at DAs in Toronto, you see that more than 1,500 4 in 10, 40% have ratios of 150% or higher, and 12% of all DAs have ratios of greater than 200%. Moreover, the burden of debt falls disproportionately on vulnerable households. Consumer debt, for instance, represents over half of average total income in DAs in the bottom 10% of the index, but only 21% of the incomes of those in the top. And predictably, mortgage debt weighs more heavily on DAs falling in the middle deciles, reflecting obviously the very high cost of housing for those and levels of indebtedness. But these are the high stories on some of the individual indicators, but the real value certainly of the index is to drop it down and to look at the spatial patterns and the distinct, what we find when we look at all of these drivers of security together. And in this sense, we find a tremendous amount of variation across 3,600 DAs in the city. In Toronto, we've sort of taken the liberty of creating a few, Liz called them buckets, groupings of neighborhoods that I think are important. You know, they're types that are important to pay attention as we look to policy intervention and change. The first group we should point out, and we've talked about obviously the tremendous trend toward growing income and wealth disparity, is the group that we've called living large. And these are DAs with high income, high wealth, and high debt. So roughly looking virtually all of Toronto's high wealth DAs are also high income DAs. Obviously that's highly correlated. In total, 5% of all DAs have high income levels and of wealth, but 13% here report also high above average levels of wealth and high income. And these areas, of course, are the most likely to carry very high levels of debt. Understandably, these are the areas that are investing in much more expensive real estate and the like, have much taken on. But they are also the areas that have the financial resources to deal with levels of debt that they're incurring. So what I've done here is I've picked out different typologies, and this is a particular small area in the Princess Rosethorn neighborhood in the west end of Toronto. There's another group, of course, that we see. Lower income neighborhoods, by contrast, typically report low levels of wealth, relatively low levels of mortgage and consumer debt, and these areas, of course, typically include large numbers of renters, so that's not ununderstandable. They also carry lower levels of debt compared to, because many, as I said, many are not actually homeowners. But this represents actually 1/3 of all DAs in Toronto fit this profile, 34%, which is something to consider. This area is in the Junction, it's midwest of Toronto. We have another group we've called okay but vulnerable. but these titles are up for grabs, but okay, but vulnerable. These tend to be groups in the middle of the range. They have average incomes. Neighborhoods tend to be average range of income, but they're reporting much higher levels of mortgage debt in particular. And certainly these will be areas that will be very influenced as interest rates track further as they predictably go higher. So you see some of the statistics. This is an area in North Toronto. And of course, lastly, in this particular presentation, we were very concerned also about the DAs that also struggle with the added, not only of high debt, but the added struggle of low savings. And it's that particular combination of low savings and high debt that place households on a precarious footing. So this area is in the East End in Scarborough Village, very high, quite degree of financial security around it. But this area in particular has very low levels of savings and very high debt. So overall in Toronto, 43% of all DAs carry above average consumer debt, 53% carry above average mortgage debt, and a third fall into both of these groups. And of this group, over half have very low liquid savings, and that's roughly 16% of all DAs. So we're just sliding to the conclusion. Obviously, this raises lots of questions for us and the value and the utility of this to further financial empowerment work in the community. We're very excited about our current work, what we're doing now. We've been looking, we had 5 pilot communities. We're expanding this pilot. We've bought the data for all of Canada, and we're now doing a national report that will look at the trends comparing communities of different sizes and the different drivers. Using this, very exciting. We're getting ready to launch nationally. But because you people are lovely, we are more than happy to let you see the mock-up of the website and all of the behind-the-scenes work that we've done to create this product. And I very much would welcome your questions and further input and insight. This still is a work in progress. I would value that opportunity. And thank you to you all. There we are.
Thank you, Katherine.
There we are.
It's fantastic. We are actually ahead of schedule, so thank you to our brilliant speakers. We have 10 minutes if we want to open it up for questions to Katherine or Patrick. I think Derek has probably left us, but anybody have questions? We have roving mics, so just put your hand up if you have a question. John over here. Chloe, John's back there.
Comment and a question, and really it's for all the speakers this morning. The role of the informal economy. West Neighbourhood House here in Toronto did a couple of studies that were Metcalf funded, where we were able to get focus groups of people who are actually living in the informal economy and working in the informal economy. And one of the things that really struck us in terms of what people said when they worked in the informal economy, dog walkers, people working as gardeners, as part-time musicians, everything that you can do in the informal economy, clean offices, cleaning houses, etc., is that they use the proceeds of the money that they got in the informal economy largely to pay off consumer debt. So on the one hand, you're not going to hear a lot about it because people don't admit to working in the informal economy. There is some stigma to that, even if it's not otherwise illegal activity. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists and speakers this morning would like to comment on how they have tried to or address the problem of getting data on the informal economy as it relates to paying off debt and actually having a bit of a good effect in terms of income volatility, because they're actually able to pay off some, especially the debt that hounds them the most. That's what they usually pay off first, and they do it with the informal income. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Do we have any speaker who wants to address that? Great.
So, I mean, we've certainly been measuring the growth of the contingent workforce insofar as it's participating on platforms. I think you're alluding to informal work that stretches well beyond that. And so what I can say is based on what we've seen on the online platform economy, and I would say Certainly, they are, we haven't looked at paying off debt as an outcome. What we have looked at is the extent to which people are employed and the level of earnings that they're earning when they are participating on those platforms. And one thing we do note is that the levels of participation is a much higher among those who are not currently employed. And among those who are employed, their incomes generally tend to be lower in the moments when they're participating. So I do think they're using it as a stopgap measure to smooth their income during moments of unemployment or when they're experiencing a dip in their income, but we haven't yet looked at the outcomes in terms of consumer debt payments. It's a good idea.
Anybody else who would like to speak to that? Great. Andrew, there's a mic coming behind you.
Okay. So to the extent that today is about identifying data gaps, I think, John, you've hit on a data gap. The informal economy is extremely hard to measure at the micro level. That's why it's informal. Statistics Canada's income estimates are based upon many places, but centrally it comes, at least at the household level, the ones that I was providing to you today, centrally come from tax sources with some other things added in, but it doesn't really, we recognize that that's an income gap for us. We don't measure those kinds of activities. But I would like to note, probably some of the other speakers this morning don't have the same problem. Like if they're using a questionnaire where people are self-identifying themselves to be within certain income brackets, there's a good chance that people are adding in their informal income as well in those. So there's a bit of a mix, I think.
Great. Do we have anybody else like to speak to that before we move on to another question? No. Okay, are there other questions? Nope. Oh, yes.
Question about the Johnsons. I'm assuming it's 2012 that they were surveyed. Is the house they own, did they own it in 2007? Did they borrow against it? And is the home equity under the value of the debt they carry today?
Fantastic question that I do not have the answer to, but let's reach out after and I'll try to dig it up for you. I know they owned it in the beginning of the study and at the end in that 1 year period. I don't know before that.
Thank you. Anybody else? Andrew.
Okay, a question for Katherine. I love typologies.
Yeah, good.
and we woefully underuse them at StatCan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be great if we could use them more. So my question for you is, how neatly do your neighborhoods slot into these 4 typologies? Do you ever have a hard time figuring out where to put some of them?
Grievously hard time because there are 6 variables. It was, the finding that working at the DA level was fantastic from our community partners that wanted that level of precision to what the trends were, but not so great when you're looking at the bird's eye view from looking down trying to. So those are general large groupings, but there are a plurality of different buckets and permutations, as you can well imagine. But certainly that certainly is not an exclusive typology. I should have said that at the onset. Like not every neighborhood in Toronto fits into one of those 4 buckets. There's a great deal of, but to communicate, we're trying, obviously, one of our struggles as researchers, and I certainly think that particularly working in the community sector, is how do you tell your story? And these kinds of tools are really valuable to look at that and to try to, and mapping, certainly my own experience has been like mapping tools and the likes are hugely powerful tools to connect trends to where people live, like Liz did, right? She said, oh, that's my office, so yes, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot of plurality. There were many more types that could be, and we're also, among friends, there's a lot of trouble working with data like these that have huge skew, right? It's a real problem when you have like an 18-time gaps. If you're looking at standard, it really becomes a problem of how you would analyze that in any meaningful way, like to capture as the 1%ers run away, that how do you tell the story about what's going on in the bottom? And so I think there are challenges to measurement. I was really struck, They're doing, I don't know if you're lucky enough to be going to the OAC, they're doing a measurement study on income inequality or wealth inequality in a month's time in some fantastic European location. I think it's Paris. But there's really, a lot of work we need to be doing to try to better capture and then translate that into community-based research, because it's one thing to be doing it in the ivory towers. Really the challenge here is how do we take that information and drill it down and make it real in terms of interventions and the like. So, but yes.
Great.